What's going on, everyone? I didn't realize I was muted. Hold on, let me make sure my mic is working. It gave me an error a minute ago. Looks like everything's okay. All right. Yeah, this episode's going to be unique. I wanted to cover a lot of different things. I have multiple videos ready for everybody, probably 4 or 5. I want to cover the geologic column because I still see a lot of confusion, even among young Earth creationists. So we're going to clear this up today. I like this picture. I think it's pretty funny. Is there truth to the geologic column? Obviously, there is a little bit of truth. I mean, we're not going to dig down and go into the future. So therefore, there is something of the past that happened. But that record that we see occurred obviously from the flood. The evidence for that is beyond overwhelming. I think that's pretty much why scripture relates that people are willingly ignorant of the flood, because it's so obvious that it occurred. The evidence is everywhere. So you would have to be ignorant. That's why it uses such strong language, in my opinion, for those types of people. So we might jump right into this, but we are going to cover a bunch of different topics. I mostly want to focus on the flood, but as usual, I like to start things off with random things that come to my head. And one of those things that I really don't like is the fact that young Earth creation isn't taught in schools, even though, as you can see from the picture of the post that I made, the vast majority are completely fine with teaching creation in schools. So if the vast majority want it taught and are fine with it being taught, why isn't it taught? I'm pretty sure you guys know why, but we're going to go over this for anybody that's new.
There's a reason intelligent design isn't taught in our learning institutions. The legal staff of Freedom from Religion Foundation, a church-state watchdog group, has had remarkable success in convincing many institutions, such as school boards and town councils, that they are breaking constitutional law when they sponsor sectarian activities. That includes intelligent design. When the authorities can't be convinced, Freedom from Religion Foundation sues, and it wins more often than not.
You recognize that woman? I didn't really know who she was. I had to look her up, and I found out she argues and debates against creationists. And lo and behold, Kent actually had a debate with her. I was shocked. She is just a scoffer, atheist, like usual. Mostly just tries to put the burden of proof on us, and I'm fine with that myself. I mean, that's obviously we want to prove that it's true, but the thing in science is proving something false. So if you can prove that a theory is wrong, it's been falsified. So Kent was giving her tons of evidence from multiple different fields of science showing that they don't point towards evolution, and she was just obviously not having it. And I think that's one of the main people, the hurdle is people like her that don't want to even give options for people. They're communist, right? It's our way or no way at all. We'll deplatform you. That's what we're up against. So for people that are content just sitting on their hands and letting people like Aaron Raw rampage over YouTube, that's no good. We need to stand up and fight these enemies, just like the prophets fought against the false prophets of Baal and all those things in scripture that talk about these. Some of us like the war, others don't. So if you don't, that's fine. That's all right. Some of you might not like to do it, but therefore you just encourage those that do like to do it, or you can go out and challenge them and then hand them off to us, for example. Don't mind it at all. So that's always good as well. The big scoffers will never change their minds. So trying to convince them, and I hear all these people, I'm praying for Aaron Raw. Why would you waste your time? It's like, it's never going to happen. I mean, not even on his deathbed. These are apostates as much as you can get. These people are reprobates through and through. So Let us move on now because I'm just going on tangents. I don't know how long I'll be able to go, so let's just assume I have 40 minutes to go. And I want to get into the fossil records, so I've made some videos. Unfortunately, when I play them, if I upload them, I can't talk while it's being played. I guess that's a good thing because I can be long-winded sometimes. But there's a lot that I want to go through in some of these videos, so try to pay attention if possible. The first one, I'm going to show you that dinosaur bones can literally be found on the ground, not digging or anything, literally on the ground. You can walk over and pick them up and say, this is a dinosaur fossil. Now, this isn't every place in the world, and we're going to get into why that is, but that should be a pause for concern. And these are the scientists that admit this and do it. And they admit a lot more as well. So here we go.
This man's search for dinosaur fossils takes him to extremes.
170.
What have you found?
Probably one of the biggest dinosaur tracks in the world.
The last time I filmed with Steve Salisbury in the Kimberley, he was walking in the footsteps of a stegosaur.
Left foot, right foot, and then as he's come into this one with his left foot, it's gone for a bit of a...
Now the hunt for fossil treasure has taken him to the frozen continent, and this time he's filmed it himself.
A lot of the places we went to, no one's ever walked over this ground. So to start to find fossils, you just got to go out there and look.
Earlier this year, Steve joined a US-led expedition to the Antarctic Peninsula. The mission of this crack team of international scientists? To reveal the lost world from the age of dinosaurs. Antarctica has its own particular challenges for fossil hunters.
It's pretty amazing how quickly the weather can change. You can have one day where it's nice and sunny and you can be outside almost wearing t-shirts, and then, you know, overnight a blizzard can roll in, and the following day you can have -30 wind chill and snow everywhere. So I had to kind of be ready to deal with all that sort of thing all the time. Because if there's too much snow, you can't see the ground anymore, which makes looking for fossils really difficult. Most of Antarctica obviously is frozen. There are a couple of parts of it though that don't have snow and ice on them for a few parts of the year. And there's the very northern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, which during the austral summer, the rocks there are exposed. And for us, what's really exciting is those rocks come from the end of the age of dinosaurs.
The geological layer that marks this event is known as the Cretaceous Paleogene, or KT boundary. The rocks here were deposited over a time span of 20 million years or so, before and after the KT boundary.
You want to see what survived the extinction event and how it affected everything. You need a continuation of deposition. So you need rocks that show what was there before, you need the event, and then you need everything afterwards. Yeah, in Antarctica, the James Ross Island group is where you can see that. So it's a great place to test a lot of our ideas about how this extinction event worked. So what we've done is we've started by setting up 50 by 100 metre quadrats, and we're just slowly walking up and down through the section, the long lines in the quadrats, looking at pretty much every rock, and we'll keep doing that until we've covered most of the hill, and that'll probably take the better part of 10 days or so.
The ground is strewn with marine fossils, such as these nautilus-like ammonites.
If you could go back in time and look at an ammonite swimming around this ancient ocean 70 million years ago, it would look something like a squid in a shell.
Rather than just small shards of bone eroded out of the rock, they started finding large, intact skeletons. They're not from dinosaurs, but from marine reptiles known as plesiosaurs.
All right, so I'm sure you noticed that the first thing there were the dinosaur fossils laying on the ground. But how? How could erosion alone over millions of years from wind blow away hundreds of millions of years of sediments, just evaporate it, but yet leave a perfect layer, and then leave large intact dinosaur layers, bones, fossils, right there? That makes no sense. What's going on? What could have removed those upper layers, and where could they have gone? You see, this is the thing, because if we were to test that region, it would date very old. So they assume, oh, it's part of the lower layers, but the upper layers are missing. Okay, so where did they go? Are they around in that area? Are they missing entirely? These are things that you never really hear about. So we're going to cover that. But first, I have two more videos that I want to show you. One is a little bit longer. It's about 7 minutes. George gave it to me. It's how things that are young can be on a top layer and vice versa. And then we will go over one that I made specifically. And actually another really good one that I found, where there's another machine that doesn't replicate the flood or the layers, but how mountains are formed. Now, that's the real answer to that. Not the geologic layers and on how those formed from the flood, but mountain formation. I believe this is the key. So let's move on and do the first video now.
Under submerged conditions, lamination also occurs during gradual aggradation of the bed under plain bed conditions. Here's the same lamination sequence in accelerated motion. Large-scale experiments on stratification were carried out at the hydraulics laboratory of the Colorado State University Engineering Research Center. For the experiments, a 4-foot wide flume measuring 60 foot long recirculates 1,000 cubic feet of water and 8 tons of a sand mixture. This flume provides a continuous supply of coarse and fine sand particles under steady discharge conditions.
Consider a typical delta sketched on the board. At the initial time T1, the delta is comprised of 3 parts: the top set, the foreset, and the bottom set slope at initial time T1. Over time, the coarse particles rolling on the bed slide down the foreset slope of the delta and accumulate as the delta progresses in the downstream direction. Finer particles rolling on the bed settle and form a layer of primarily fine particles. The particles in suspension are carried through and deposit on the bottom set slope of the delta. After a certain time interval, we get a second bed profile at time T2. The sediments accumulated on the bed from time T1 to T2 define what is called a layer of sediment. A layer of sediment is the accumulation of sediment between the initial time T1 and the subsequent time T2.
This typical delta gradually progresses in the downstream direction A close look at the top set slope in slow motion clearly shows a laminated deposit of finer particles. The thickness of the top set deposit decreases in the downstream direction as the foreset slope of the delta is approached.
Over a long period of time, the accumulation of sediments displays clear stratification with fine particles on top, coarse particles in the middle, and fine particles on the bottom. It is important to understand that the chronology of the formation of the deposits depends on the layers and not on the strata.
Isochrones correspond to the interface between successive layers, not strata. The thickness of strata is determined by the changes in sediment transport that occur in non-uniform flow.
Let's now consider two particles in the delta. Particle A in the upper strata and particle B in the lower strata. Particle A deposited at a time T1 before particle B. Particle B in the lower strata therefore deposited after particle A in the upper strata.
Increasing the flow depth while keeping the discharge and the supply of sediment unchanged results in more complex sedimentary features. Substantial deposits accumulate with features including deltas, dunes, and ripples at various stages of development. A dried delta, viewed from the flume sidewalls, displays clear stratification characteristics in terms of superposition of deposits with similar particle size distribution. A cross-section is cut through the delta to examine the primary features of deposits of sediment mixtures carried out under steady flow and a continuous sediment supply. The cross-section displays a clear superposition of strata of fine particles in white and coarse particles in black with clear lamination. Looking at the cross-section of superposed strata, it is tempting to conclude that the strata correspond to successive sedimentary layers, that they result from discontinuous sedimentary periods, that each strata is younger than the one underneath it and older than the one above it, and that all points of the same strata have the same age.
The stratification experiment invalidates these hypotheses because these strata are not identical to successive layers. Moreover, clear stratification is observed under a continuous supply of heterogeneous sand particles.
Why is this important? Well, quite simply, because strata have been used to date sedimentary rocks and the fossils in them for over 100 years. And now, for the first time ever, there is experimental proof to show how strata form. And it is quite obvious that strata cannot be used to date either fossils or rocks. In fact, the fossils in the bottom strata could be younger than the fossils in the top strata.
Here you see some sea creatures which live at different ecological levels. A heavy influx of sediment arrives and they all get buried. Eventually, if no air gets to them, they could turn into fossils. Obviously, those buried in the top strata are the same age as those in the bottom strata, as they were buried in the same layer of sediment. Then another heavy layer of sediment arrives, and more sea creatures are trapped. But what is more important is the ones at the top of the previous layer were buried before the one in the bottom of the last layer. So the one at the top here is older than the one at the bottom.
Very fascinating, right? These experiments are awesome because they show our preconception of what we think we know, and then we have to go back and question everything. Remember, evolution doesn't believe or even consider catastrophism. And that's one of the biggest problems, is because by the time you exclude a possibility, you've just now entered the realm of pseudoscience, or like a dogma, right? It's almost like a cult. You're like, well, my belief says this. We're not going to consider any of those other ones, but we're right. Well, wait a minute. How do you know you won't consider the others? So that's one of my biggest contentions, other than the fact that every prediction they've made has come in completely wrong. But I digress. Next is another very important video that I wanted to show you, and it doesn't talk about how the flood layers form as they add sediments, rather plate subduction and mountain formation. Remember, this is at the end of the flood, and the reason we're going to go over this is because this is going to start explaining why there are different geologic layers exposed and why they believe that they're ages. Again, very similar to that picture that I find funny. So this one answers only one of those questions, and then we'll answer the unsolvable part at the end. So here we go. Just a couple minutes.
How do mountains form? French geologist Jacques Malavier builds sand models that mimic the formation of mountain belts and allow scientists to study this complex process.
Sand is a very good material for simulating rock deformation. In the experiment, the different stratigraphic layers which represent the sediments and the continental crust have different mechanical properties. We mix the sand grains with a finer powder, which increases the sand's resistance to deformation. Thus, we have heterogeneous material made up of more resistant layers and less resistant layers.
Mountain belts are created when continents collide. In this experiment, we see two continents separated by an ocean. Now watch what happens as the plates converge. As one plate subducts or dives beneath the other, the ocean basin closes. The continental crust, which is lighter than oceanic crust, cannot be subducted. Instead, as the continents collide, the crust thickens and is forced up. Note how the sand is folded and faulted. We see similar structures in the rocks in mountains. One important factor not accounted for in this model is erosion. Erosion exposes the deformed rocks that were once deeply buried in the mountain belt. The green sand represents the rocks of the ocean basin. Note that it's been trapped between the two continents, marking their original boundary. These too we see in mountain belts. It's very difficult to understand the deep structure of a mountain belt by direct observation. The sand model allows us to compress time and space and simulates the internal structure of mountains.
And there we have it. Okay, so I'm going to share screen because I want you to see that picture one more time. In particular, this one. You can see that the layers are inside the mountains, which obviously today, just looking at the outside here, we can't see those layers, but there are places where it's cracked open and we can. So how come in this simulation then are we looking at these different layers but nothing is exposed? How come we don't see these deeper layers, which evolutionists believe would be older? And I would say that this is because this simulation didn't have any water flowing off of it. Because as you know, when we talk about the flood, we have to consider what the scripture says about it. And that is that the water and the rain stopped and the waters receded from the earth and from the continents, and they went back into the oceans as the waters were running off of them, as we can see in this Northern California or United States map. And as the water came off, it would bring with it sediments in some of these layers, and it would be exposing them. And this is what we see. And you'll see this throughout different continents. Imagine this water dumping off the continents like that. It's not going to happen everywhere. Water doesn't do that, but it does in a lot of regions. For example, in Montana. And here's a map that you can see flowing off into the Gulf of Mexico. And it brought with it lots of sediments and sand. And that is still there to this day. Why would that be there if there was not a massive, gigantic flood runoff from the continent itself? There's only one answer for that, people. It's the only thing that makes any sense at all. So we will move on to the next one now. Actually, oh, here's some more. I forgot I added some. Probably because the layers that we know formed from the flood, that a lot of evolutionists believe that these are layers based on the radiometric dating, which we've gone over. You know, if this is all submerged, the heaviest elements are going to be in the bottom because these are subatomic, very small particles. And they're not like the rest of these rocks here that are going to, you know, if they're all wet and at one time underneath all water, you're going to get the heaviest sinking down into the deepest layer. And that is what we see from radiometric dating, right? The uranium is going to go deeper. It is the heaviest particle that there is. And we get the lighter ones that date younger. That's the only reason that they are the way that they are. Okay. And then we have this. This is in Montana. Why would we have flood deposition looking layers that we would get from that experiment we saw earlier, where there are large rocks followed by smaller grains, followed by even smaller, and then the smallest layered on top of one another over and over and over again? That only makes sense if we consider a flood bringing water in and taking water back out over and over as it flooded the continents. We see this in the geologic column, but they are unwilling to accept catastrophism or even look at it. They would just say that this was probably a local flood, or this was during the ice age when their glaciers were melting. That's it. But look at that. What do we have? Sorry, I'll show you guys that again. Let this one really sink in. The pre-Mesozoic fossils are older than the ocean floor itself. How could that be? They're much higher, aren't they? It's because they were pushed up. And this is what we see. These, I'm going to run out of time. Let's look at this. I love this. Here's another perfect example of why the layers cannot be deep time. This is a trilobite cartoon, of course, going through geologic layers. Why? Because this is what we see. Literal tracks going through different geologic layers and ages of time. Why? Because as the flood was coming in and out, they were going through higher layers trying to survive. They were fighting their way to the top. And eventually they couldn't do it anymore. They got trapped and fossilized because of the flood. So those are the ones that I really wanted to cover with you the most. Those are by far the most important things that we cover. And what brought me to going over this today is something that I saw in a video. And it was an extinct creature that they believe, based on evolutionary geologic layers, didn't live at the time of man because it was found only in rock layers that were very old. Lo and behold, we find people documented using them, and they were in artwork. So check this out. Obviously, ignore the dates, but you'll get the gist of it. Here we go.
The Civatherium is an extinct genus of giraffids. Or in plain English, it was a type of giant primordial giraffe that used to roam across India and Africa. It was one of the biggest land animals in history, looking like an okapi but standing over 10 feet tall. Most scientists agree that the giant giraffe began going extinct 7 million years ago in the late Miocene period, then was completely gone by just 1 million years ago. But there is a bit of a discrepancy. In the ancient kingdom of Kish in Iraq, there was an enormous animal that looked an awful lot like a Civatherium that was tamed and ridden by humans. At least that's what the archaeological evidence shows us. Archaeologists have found rock paintings in the Sahara of gigantic giraffes, painted 8,000 years ago. During an excavation in Kish in the 1920s, an elaborate copper rain ring that was fixed to a chariot was discovered from 3500 BC. It was shaped just like a sieve Ethereum. It was incredible because most rain rings depict things like horses and ordinary camels, but this one was unique, showing an enormous beast that couldn't possibly have existed back then. Or could it? This is what scientists can't figure out. We know that Sumerians tamed all kinds of wild animals, even allegedly taming deer to pull their chariots, but they also seem to have tamed wild, massive giraffes. As unlikely as this, there is a sliver of a chance that some of these beasts, just a few, survived until around 5,500 years ago, and that the Sumerians rode around on them like gigantic horses. Do you think that...
Good times right there. Good times. Why? Again, all because of this. The paradigm driving the conclusion, right? We see these lower layers. We go, well, those lower layers are such an old time that the upper layers, we can't find any evidence that they were there, so therefore they didn't live. And then all of a sudden, what do we find? Actual people interacting with these things, right? Again, that's why it's so confusing for scientists. They're befuddled because according to them and their paradigm, this shouldn't be happening. It doesn't work like that. So let's go over some other things now. Here we have the Tapete sandstone. We find this around the world in different places. We find this in the Grand Canyon. We see that on the top right over here on number 1. We find it going over, it looks like north of Florida, a couple states over from that. And then we go all the way over into Africa and then again in the Middle East, up where the Fertile Crescent is. All of it is exposed. So if something were to die on that layer, how would it be dated if it was in that layer? Well, it would get dated very old. That is not good when you're trying to determine if this is true history or not, right? Because they're judging the fossil based on the rock that it's in, because they're using the radiometric dating on the rock, not the fossil. So, and then again, why do we have these layers like this, where some of them are exposed, right? We have they say, well, the older rocks are in the West. Why? Radiometric dating, right? It's lower. Yeah, well, guess what? When the layers were forming, that's right. The radiometric elements that date the oldest, like uranium, do seep down into these lower ones. And then when the mountains formed and they started going up, it was carried with it. And then it broke off as the waters receded from the earth, exposing most of these other layers like this. Or when there was an earthquake and it broke open. There's things like the Grand Canyon, not exactly sure positively how it formed, probably during the flood. There's different theories, but whatever the reason was, it exposed it. It broke it open. Looks like there was a cataclysm of some sort, right? Where the water was flowing off, exposed the different layers. That's what we see. And we have all this massive amounts of geologic layering that was washed out of that area that's now exposed for us to go in and look at, and they deem older, all because of radiometric dating. They can't see any of this other evidence and are unwilling to accept it and see it. And here's another perfect example of that, where the geologic layers have been eroded away, and what is exposed and what is left is that. Now, what happens is when we have trees being planted and dropped on these things, now we have layers above it of not rock layers, but of what do we plant in? I can't even think of the name. Soil. We have soil layers now forming above that, right? But right underneath it are those rock layers. So when there's different forests and things growing on top of it, we go, oh, that when things die on that, right in the soil, we go down, and what rock layer is it above? Guess what? It just depends on what happened during the flood. When we look at Africa, look at what we see. Look at all the different geologic layers that are exposed in these different areas. And that you can see that the date on the left is what they assume how old these layers are. Again, another more depicted map with a little bit more detail of northern Africa. Then we can get into southern Africa, and we find exactly the same thing. Different geologic layers exposed, therefore supposedly different geologic eras. Not true. How do we know this is not true? Again, I made this chart quite a while ago. It shows the atomic mass and weight of the different elements and how they go from heaviest to lightest and how they are dated based on that. pretty much case closed. I mean, it's pretty much over. So what is this idea that this Africa continent right here is our birthplace? And well, it becomes down to those rock layers at first, right? They go, well, we found humans had died on some of these rock layers, so therefore we humans must have started in this region. And then what they did is they go, well, also Africans have the most genetic diversity. So there's somewhere in Africa, right? The L haplogroup was put here at first, then it moved to here, then it moved down the south. But here's the question that they're not really asking themselves. If this is the this is the cradle of human civilization, where all humans began and where they lived for hundreds of thousands of years, they don't know exactly. It ranges from 150,000 to 300,000, somewhat more, but it really doesn't matter. We have a 200-year time, 100,000 time frame that most of them believe that this happened in. Well, what's going on here? Why we have people living in small people groups, not migrating out of Africa because the Sahara Desert has now encapsulated them in and kind of trapped them in this region. So we have small people groups and populations, and we have them just in small populations with fast mutation rates, where the substitutions are reaching fixation very quickly. And when you have lots of fixations in people groups, you would now have essentially people that have a lot of mutations, more than the other people that have now spread out. And it makes them look older, and they are not older. It makes them appear to be older. And the same thing would apply today. If people lived on like Indian tribes, for example, right? You could get just small tribes that never grew in population like they do in Africa, and then they're just dispersed all over the continent. You would eventually get people groups that have lots of more fixed mutations than other groups, and therefore they would be older. And we know from the new mutation rate given discovered by Dr. Jensen, 3 mutations per generation, this is in the Y chromosome, that you don't have a lot of time, because the average person has 440 mutations. That's like around 150 generations ago. That's not that long ago. You just don't have a lot of time. And here's something that refutes that idea, is when we look at haplogroup formation. How come when we get near the Fertile Crescent, we get all of the haplogroups forming? We get the vast majority of all these haplogroups exploding in this region, where, you know, this is the Fertile Crescent and this is Africa down here. Now, remember, according to evolution theory, man was down here and was ready to leave Africa. The green is like one of the borders, of course. I would say that in this map, it's just representing haplogroup, I think R, but kind of looks like sand, because that would be the desert, right? So what's happening? Why would all these haplogroups randomly form in this region to the north and not in Africa? Right? Because if you're in Africa and you have the most genetic diversity on Earth, and then people are diverging and spreading around all around the continent, wouldn't mutations diverging into different people groups form these haplogroups? Because that's how haplogroups are formed, right? But yet that's not what we see. We see the haplogroups forming around the Middle East and around in India, right in the north. Why is that? Why is it not in Africa? That makes no sense. So these formations of haplogroups forming rather fast and right around each other at the exact same time is more reminiscent of what we would expect in the biblical story, where the generations of Peleg spread out from Babel, and that is where we would get different populations of people now branching off and forming their own groups, because now they have their own language and writing system, and they breed with each other. A new mutation forms, rises to fixation. Boom, we have a new haplogroup formed. But that can't happen if all the people groups are exactly the same. So what happens is they start to spread. Another group spreads out. Boom, another haplogroup forms. They don't intermingle with the other one, right? So that's exactly what we're seeing here. We're seeing a dispersion of the human race going all around the globe. And all of it's forming around the same place, right? Ironically, right around where Babel was. What are the odds? Interesting. It seems like biblical history and the history of humanity is in the biblical genetics model. of ancestry. And I find that fascinating, that we're literally reading the history of the book of the world. And a lot of denominations want to just say, oh no, that's all allegorical, or that doesn't matter at all. You don't even need Genesis. It doesn't matter. There's no point to it at all. They're missing out on so many good tools to evangelize and build and root strength for these kids that are going to grow up and learn the opposite of this in school. And they're going to have no alternative. Their minds aren't going to be receptive to anything except revolution after a while. They're going to be indoctrinated because their parents didn't give them this type of information where they can be rooted in the truth. And when they go and they learn these other concepts, you can take it in, you can study it, you can learn it, and then you can just say, it just doesn't make any sense. It's got too many holes. You know, it doesn't make it. All the predictions are wrong. You guys ignore all this kind of evidence. So that's why I like young earth creation as my main tool for evangelism. And I think I always will, because we live in a secular world where the reason people are falling away is because of the theory of evolution when they go off to school, and a lot of people in college. And they don't know that there's an alternative. They don't know that there's answers to these questions. If they're asked, they don't know. And the atheist jumps on these opportunities. They look for people that don't know these topics, so they can just bombard them with information, and then they're just left like, wow, it's kind of like losing a fight badly, right? You're like, whoa, I better start training. As where somebody that's already been training, the fight's probably going to go in their favor anyway. But even if they lose, they can go, well, I got to go back to the drawing board and study a little bit more. As where a lot of Christians that are kids, they're just going to be like, well, I was told this is truth. That's wrong. Therefore, it must be wrong. That's what we're up against, right? And a lot of people don't like Ken Ham. They don't like the Ark Encounter. They don't like Kent Hovind, right? There's these people that are already told, oh yeah, these are horrible people. It's a cult, or they just want your money. Whatever nonsense they can just fling out, right? It's like, just ignore all of this. Ignore it. Study everything. Study your enemy. I watch Aaron Raw videos. I couldn't like somebody less. Why? Because I want to know what he's teaching people. I want to know what they're learning from this guy. I want to know what they think his arguments are and why he's so convincing to them. And I want to know what he's saying so I can refute it. That's why. And not a lot of people had the time or have the time, but that's okay. Some of us did or do. So that's good. That's what I'm here for, right? That's what the young earth creation movement is about. Look at all the different models. There are some people that literally will always believe in evolution. They think that the days were not days, and they will not concede that. They'll be like, no, they had to be vast amounts of time. We're going with the secular camp on this one. We don't want to be considered like flat earthers. We'll take the mainstream, and therefore everyone will like us. Well, let me tell you something. The world isn't going to like you. Stop trying to be their friends. They're not your friends. These people hate you. They do not like you. They don't like your beliefs. They hate you. They would deplatform you if they could. They would try to do it to us. They attack us rather than the arguments as much as they can. Why? Because they want to discredit anything that we might say, while the person might not get to see the content, right? That's why, attack the person constantly, right? No, attack the arguments, attack what they're saying, attack what they're doing. You know what I mean? Go ahead. But it's just nonsense when you are really studying the topic, how anybody could believe in evolution after about 6 months of young earth creation study. There is no place for it at all. I can see how they think there is, but it falls apart extremely fast once you get past the surface level of that. And obviously, I have my personal biases when it comes to my favorite types of evidence, but we're all going to. And there's nothing really wrong with that, in my opinion, because some of us don't like genetics or biology or geology. Some of us don't like these subjects. So how in the world are we going to learn a subject so well that we just don't like? It's tedious, like pulling teeth, right? I've had to do martial arts before, and I've studied it for months just to get one kick out of it. Oh, it was so tedious, but you just do it anyway because you never know when you're going to need it. And it's the same thing with young earth creation, right? There's so many different aspects of it. There's the paleontology, the geology, the taxonomy, the cladistics. There's the mutations, biology, just in general, right? There's so many different fields and branches in those fields that go out from there that it's hard for me to always know what people really like and want. Sometimes I go with what I like. And then I realize, oh, wow, people are really into this Noah's flood thing, right? Obviously, if you go to my videos and my channel here, the most views literally go to Noah's flood. Then I go to Standing for Truth on Donnie's channel, and it's the opposite. So weird. I don't know. Some people, I guess the people that like Noah's flood really come to my channels. I thought there was enough of those channels already looking at as Genesis history, Genesis apologetics. They do a lot with Noah's flood and dinosaurs, right? I was like, okay, that niche is already taken. What possibility would there be for me to like come in and, you know, but lo and behold, I'm not going to just not do videos on it, because most of these organizations hold to only one aspect, right? Only one flood model, only this flood model, or only that viewpoint of ancestry. I just take it all. I just take it all in. And I won't hold to any particular thing until I've studied it all. And oftentimes I'll combine them. I'll be like, wait a minute, you know, this flood model has a problem with where the sediments are. Like, where do they come from on these upper layers, especially, right? Like, what about limestone? How come there's different types of limestone? How come they're on different layers? And now we know, based on catastrophic plate tectonics, that once the flooding came in at these different times, and from what you just witnessed, is that the flood will deposit these different layers independent of time. And where do they come from? Well, unfortunately, you would either need deep time to biologically make limestone from coral, which would need pristine conditions, like literally shallow water, very warm, and tons of carbon over eons of time, untouched. And then, or you would just could do it rapidly fast, extremely fast during the flood. It was made in a chemical process underneath the earth, like in Walt Brown's theory. Well, boom, there's your answer. Don't compete against it. Just incorporate it, embrace it. It's a great answer. We have it. We have all the answers. So that's where I come from. I'm going to do more of these geological things. People seem to really like them. I like the genetics, but you know what? I'm going to do what the people want. I don't really care what I want to do. I'm here for the audience. I'm here for what people need to learn, what they like to learn, what they want to learn, what's going to help the most people. And if that's geology, then so be it. Goodbye, genetics. Oh, well, everyone. I hope you enjoyed 50 minutes. Pretty good. Had a lot of time today. That was exciting. I enjoyed it. I hope you did too. And until next time.